What is going on, everybody? Shwazy here, and behind me I have two of some of the coolest vehicles on the market today. We're talking the Dodge Challenger Hellcat and the C8 Corvette, and in today's video I'm going to be telling you which one you should buy and why. Okay, so we have the Dodge Challenger Hellcat, the embodiment of American muscle, 717 horsepower, and we have the C8 Corvette, which is an affordable, exotic supercar that competes with Lamborghinis and Ferraris. So which one of these two would I recommend that you should buy? Now, this is an interesting question because in some ways, these two vehicles are extremely similar. They're both rear-wheel drive sports cars slash muscle cars. They're both American manufactured vehicles. They both got a 6.2 liter engine, and they both cost about the same price, which we'll get to here in just a minute. But in a lot of ways, they are extremely different vehicles. I mean, just looking at the front end, you could probably tell the difference. I do apologize about the lighting. The sun is directly above us, but I'll do the best I can with what I have. Now, if you guys have followed my channel for a while, you'll know that I've been kind of head over heels about the C8 Corvette. And in all honesty, if there was any vehicle that I would sell this Hellcat for, it would be a C8 Corvette. So I figured I'm probably not the only person that would want to know the difference between these two vehicles and which one I would recommend, coming from a Hellcat owner's perspective. Now we're going to start this video off with the meat and potatoes, where I'm going to talk about the styling, the specs, everything you should know, which may convince you to pick one over the other. And then I'm going to finish this video off with 3 reasons why I'm actually still going to stick with the Dodge Challenger Hellcat Widebody over a C8 Corvette. So let's get started. Okay, let's start off with the styling. First off, we're going to start with the Hellcat. This is a familiar body. I think everybody knows what these look like, but let me do a quick 360. This has a really wide rear end. I mean, there's no hiding in this vehicle. It's massive. It's huge. It takes up a lot of space, a lot of presence, and mine particularly is in the Hellraisin color, which is really nice. Kind of hard to capture on camera, but overall a really good, mean and menacing front end. I mean, this thing looks like a really true retro 60s to 70s Challenger. This, on the other hand, is completely different. It doesn't look like any other Corvette that came before it. This is the first ever, of course, mid-engine Corvette, and this thing, in my opinion, looks like an exotic supercar. You know, think McLaren, think Ferrari, although at the same time, it has its own unique styling. They didn't copy anything from those vehicles, but also can easily be compared to those exotic supercars, and it's a really good looking vehicle. Now, it's interesting, this is also technically a convertible, so you do have an electronic release over here, but this part over here can actually come off, and you can actually store it inside of the trunk over here. Now, there's actually 2 trunks in this vehicle. Before we go inside, I just want to show you what that looks like. This is the first trunk, and this is where you can actually hide your roof and just place it in here and then shut the trunk and be fine and have a convertible. Of course, you have the mid-engine over there, and then this is a soft close, by the way. Jumping inside, this is what the interior looks like, and it is incredible. I mean, this thing is a very cockpit-oriented type of fighter jet interior where everything kind of wraps around you. And that's what I'm going to talk about later in this video, because that is probably one of the biggest differences between these two vehicles. Now, jumping in, the first thing you'll notice is you are incredibly low to the ground. Like, I can touch the ground over here very easily. I'm probably about 3 inches away from the ground, and it's really low. I mean, the entire seating position, you're sitting below everybody else. Like, I was driving next to a Cadillac CTS the other day, and it was probably up to here in terms of its window. This feels like you're below pretty much every other vehicle, whereas the Challenger is a little bit different. We're going to jump in there and I'll show you what that looks like. But you do have 2 displays over here. Turning this car on, you do have an all digital display. This is actually, I believe, a 12 or 12.3 inch display, really nice. This, on the other hand, is an 8-inch display, which is a little bit smaller than that in the Challenger. You do have your transmission selector here. You've got your sport mode controls underneath this little rest over here. And then coming over here, you do have 2 cup holders. And then this is all of your climate control settings over here. So pretty simple and straightforward. And then you just have a little compartment for just, your phone or just some little knickknacks knickknacks here and there. On the passenger side, you do have 2 air vents, and then pushing this button opens up the glove compartment. But that's it for the passenger side. You do have a little storage compartment here, which if you get the higher trim level, you will get a wireless charger. Then there's your speaker grill right there. You do have the Bose audio system. This is the 10 speaker, but you can get more speakers in the higher trim levels. And then up here, the only thing you have is your OnStart controls and then your hazards. And then this is how you remove the roof. You just pull out, you know, these little things over here, and then this one back here, and then that will open up this roof and you can store it in the trunk, which gives you a nice convertible-like experience. You do have a square-like steering wheel, which is a little bit different than that in the Challenger. You do have your audio controls over here on the right-hand side, and this is how you kind of go through the menus on the instrument cluster. And then this is your cruise control, and then your favorite Seek track buttons. The Z button is kind of your custom mode. This is where you kind of set your, you know, different steering levels and brake feel and everything like that. And then you've got your paddle shifters over here on the left and right. They do feel really nice. But that is pretty much it on the interior. Not much more to report. So now let's jump into the Hellcat and let me show you what that looks like. One last thing to mention is this is very similar to other Corvettes where you actually have an electronic release for your door handle rather than having a physical door handle. But let's jump in the Hellcat. Okay, so jumping into the Hellcat, you have your conventional door handle, no electronic release. You guys have seen this on the channel before, but I will just do a quick summary. You got some suede Alcantara, really nice materials. You know, I do wish this had maybe a little bit of a different contrast seating color, maybe some brown or reds, but you can get that as an option. And jumping in, you know, first thing you'll notice, you know, I can touch the ground, but I really have to reach pretty far down. I'm not falling into this car, whereas in the Corvette, I'm actually falling in. Now, it's kind of hard to tell the height difference, but where I'm seated right now, the top of my head is probably where the roof line is on this vehicle. So we're talking probably, you know, 3 to 6 inches higher in this vehicle, if not more than that, as compared to the Corvette. But the interior is probably very familiar to everybody who's sat in a Challenger before. These are pretty much the same exact interior for every Challenger since 2015. But you do have an 8.4-inch touchscreen, so that's actually larger than that in the Corvette. And then you do have a digital display. I'm not exactly familiar with the size. I think it's a little over 7 inches. It's really nice. It's not the best. It's not an all-digital display like that you find in the Corvette, but it does look pretty good. I'm going to close the door because it's pretty loud outside. It's got some red gauge clusters over here, which are analog. You got it up to 200 miles an hour, which is nice. And then the rest of the interior, you do have soft touch materials. It's not as angular and as aggressive as the C8, as I'm sure you saw. It's a little bit more on the simple side, but it's a little bit more throwback. You know, older Challengers did kind of look like this. The seats are really nice. They're Alcantara. They're much wider and larger than that of the Corvette. You know, you don't have a giant pillar over here that blocks the passenger side from the driver's side. This is pretty much more open. Although it's oriented towards the driver, the passenger can still access this easily. On that car, in the passenger side, you can still see the screen, but you're almost looking at it at like a 70-degree angle, so it's kind of hard to see. You do have your climate control buttons here. It's got just as many buttons probably as the Corvette. They're just oriented a little bit differently. And then you do have a center arm console over here as well. This is a bit deeper than that in the Corvette. But the main difference here is you do have a rear set of seats back here. So my vehicle has 5 seats, and then there's 2 air vents located down here as well. So you do have quite a bit of legroom. I mean, as you can see, you can actually fit some adults back here, and then they also have cup holders in that center armrest as well. So you can easily fit, you know, a family of 4 back here. Even though it's not the easiest to get in and out of, you still have that as an option. You also have cup holders in the door, so you have a total of 4 for the front row, and then 2 more in the back, versus that one just has 2 overall. So if you really want a car for cup holders, well, the Challenger is probably the best option. Now, not only do you get a rear set of seats, you also have more trunk space over here. I mean, this is a very, very massive and large amount of space for the trunk. I've actually put 4 full-size tires in here with the rear seats down, and I have packed enough for like a weeks-long vacation back here. The Corvette is a little bit of a different story. Like I showed you, you do have that rear trunk, which isn't bad. It can fit the roof, but not nearly as large as the Hellcat. And then pushing the button underneath the headlight, you can open up a frunk, which is something the Hellcat doesn't have because you have a giant engine over here. but this isn't a bad amount of space. You could probably fit like 1 or 2 duffel bags on top of each other, but again, nowhere near the amount of space that you can find in the Hellcat. Okay, so to sum up the styling, well, it's really personal preference. I think more people will probably like the looks of this car because it looks like an exotic vehicle, but this is also a maybe acquired taste or a very interesting styling because it looks like nothing else on the market. I mean, it's muscular, it's mean, so it really depends on what you prefer because the interior and exterior styling couldn't be any more different between these two vehicles, and for that reason, I'm going to give it a draw because, well, it really depends on your subjective opinion. The second thing we're going to talk about is pricing, and that's where it gets really close between these two. I'm going to start off with the Challenger, and you know, there's plenty of different Hellcats. You can get them in the wide body, narrow body, there's jailbreak, there's super stock, there's red eyes. It's actually one of my complaints about this vehicle, but we're going to be talking about the base narrow body Hellcat all the way to the top of the line jailbreak, and in today's prices, October of 2022, you can get a narrow body Hellcat for just around $70,000 starting price. Now, I'm not talking about markups for any one of these vehicles because I'm hoping that those will eventually disappear, and it's kind of hard to predict those because it really depends on what dealer you're going to. But in a perfect world, you can walk into a dealership and get a narrow body Hellcat without really any options for $70,000. Now, this can go up to around $100,000, potentially even more if you get the jailbreak with all of the bells and whistles and the different stripes. So a $70,000 to $100,000 vehicle. Now let's jump to the C8 Corvette, and that's where the pricing is actually really similar, if not a little bit better, because you can get a base Corvette, which is very similar to this one. Not much in terms of bells and whistles, which I'll talk about here in just a minute. But this thing can start at around $65,000 without destination and delivery and without taxes. But you can get this equipped, if you do get the convertible and all of the bells and whistles, upwards to around $100,000 as well. So in terms of price range, this starts a little bit lower, but you could probably get it equipped to about the same. And if you get both of these with similar amounts of features, you're probably looking at pretty much the same price point, give or take $1,000. Okay, now this wouldn't be a fair comparison if we didn't talk about horsepower figures for both of these. Starting off with the Hellcat, I think everybody will know this is the obvious winner. This is a 6.2 liter supercharged V8 that produces 717 horsepower and 656 pound-feet of torque. Now, if you get the red eye or the jailbreak, you can get upwards of 807 horsepower out of this engine with a little bit of different internals and components. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is not only is this a 6.2 liter engine, but this supercharger is a 2.4 liter supercharger. So you get a lot of displacement here, whereas this Corvette, on the other hand, is a little bit different. You don't have any forced induction here. This is actually a naturally aspirated 6.2 liter. So in terms of displacement without superchargers, these two are exactly the same, but the horsepower figures here are a little bit different. This one only produces 490 horsepower and 465 pound-feet of torque. Now, if you do upgrade the Z51, which is about, I think, around 6,000 or 7,000 in today's money, this thing will upgrade to 495 horsepower and 470 pound-feet of torque. So you get about 5 more of each if you do upgrade, but still nowhere near the 700 to 800 horsepower that you can get on the Hellcat. So the clear victor in terms of horsepower wars will be the Dodge Challenger Hellcat. Now, where it gets interesting is actually 0 to 60, because that's actually where the Hellcat loses and the Corvette takes the cake. The 0 to 60 in the non-Z51 package is about 3 seconds for the Corvette versus the Hellcat, regardless of what trim level or engine you get, you're somewhere around 3.5 seconds. Now, the real question is, can you actually get that power to the ground and get 3.5 seconds? Well, likely not unless you're a professional driver or you have the right type of tires and the right climate. This, on the other hand, is pretty predictable. You can get this pretty consistently around 3 seconds, 0 to 60, and some people with the Z51 package have gotten this below 3 seconds out of a, $70,000 or so car. And the reason this thing is able to do that, even though it has probably 300 or so horsepower less, is engineering. I mean, we're talking a lower vehicle to the ground, better aerodynamics. I mean, just look at the height difference between these two. This thing looks pretty much like a child compared to this. You also have a mid-engine setup, so more of your weight, actually about 60% of the vehicle weight, is behind or right in front of the rear axles versus that most of the weight is up front. You also have a little bit less power, and that actually helps it in getting more of that power to the ground because you rarely lose traction in this vehicle versus this one, you know, you're really doing a lot of burnouts and stuff like that. They're just kind of different types of personalities. And so for a variety of reasons, this thing is quicker 0 to 60. So if that's what you're looking for, well, then the Corvette will take the cake. Okay, now let's talk about top speed. Max top speed of the C8 Corvette is 194 miles per hour, which is really insane considering, you know, the supercars of like 20 years ago probably didn't even reach those speeds. From what I've been told, if you do get the Z51 package, it actually worsens your aerodynamics, so your top speed is a little bit lower, but nonetheless, anything over like 160 is impressive, and the Corvette can do it in 194. Okay, now the Hellcat, on the other hand, its top speed, depending on which trim level you get, is just around 200 miles per hour. If you do get the red-eye wide body, you can actually get it up to 203 miles per hour, but as you can tell, they're very similar in terms of top speed, but the Hellcat is just slightly better in terms of its numbers. Okay, now let's talk about the sound because that is a major difference between the two. Okay, so as I'm sure you could tell, hopefully on camera, I think the Hellcat is the clear winner. Now, full disclosure here, my Hellcat does have an aftermarket muffler system, a Dynamax Race Bullets, which I made a video on the install, but even stock, I do know that this thing was louder than the Corvette. That's actually one of my complaints about the C8 is, even though it's not a bad sounding engine or exhaust by any means, this thing does sound better. This thing, not only the engine with the supercharger whine, but the exhaust system is a louder, kind of more deeper, throatier, more crackles and pops as compared to the C8 Corvette. So just keep that in mind. This thing is going to be waking your neighbors a little bit more than this thing, where it's a little bit more subdued. And maybe that has to do with the target demographic of people who are buying this vehicle versus the Hellcat. Okay, now let's talk about the sizing, because I think the Corvette actually looks a lot larger in photos and videos than it does in real life. This thing is actually pretty small. Now, I've already talked about the ride height and how this thing looks really tall versus this, and just how you're seated very low in the vehicle. But in terms of vehicle length, this is about 182 inches, which, just for comparison, that's about the length of a Honda Civic. And honestly, even in person, it feels a little bit smaller than that. This behemoth, on the other hand, this massive yacht, is actually about 198 inches, which, for comparison, that's the size of a Ford Explorer, which is a mid-size crossover. So this thing is much larger than the C8 Corvette, so just something to consider depending on where you live and how tight of a parking spot you have. Now, I do want to touch on technology. That's where it gets kind of interesting. Now, coming inside of the passenger seat, just so you guys can see the difference here, this vehicle, like I mentioned a little bit earlier in the video, is kind of a more basic version. This is the 1LT, and I don't have the window sticker for this vehicle, but I'm going to say it's probably in the mid $60,000 range just based on the features. This vehicle does not have any heated or ventilated seats as an option. It actually doesn't have any in-vehicle navigation system. It doesn't have any blind spot monitoring either. Those are all features that my Hellcat does come with, but it's not a direct comparison because this vehicle is actually much less expensive, around $65,000 versus that one was $78,000 when new. So I'm not going to compare that, but there are a few features that the Hellcat does come with that this one doesn't. I'm going to focus on one in specific, and that has to do with the adaptive cruise control. So depending on which trim level of Hellcat you get, mine doesn't have it, but you can get adaptive cruise control, which will be functioning over here on the right-hand side of the steering wheel, and you can essentially, you know, accelerate, decelerate, depending on the vehicle in front of you. That is a feature that the Hellcat does come with as an option, whereas the C8 Corvette doesn't actually even have that as an option. So aside from that one safety feature, they are both very similar in terms of technology and price point, depending on how you outfit them. One thing to note, though, is if you do get the red-eye version of the Hellcat, you actually can't get adaptive cruise control anymore. From what I've heard, that is because they need more ventilation going into the front end, and they don't want just a giant sensor kind of getting in the way. So you do have to pick a lower trim level of Hellcat if you want adaptive cruise control. Okay, now I'm going to finish off today's video talking about my real-life experience and thoughts between both of these two cars, and the 3 reasons why, at the end of the day, I'm still going to pick the Hellcat over the C8. Now that you've heard the specs, I want to talk about power delivery in my real-life life experience. It's actually very, very different between the two. This thing is much quicker 0 to 60, and it feels like that in real life. I mean, this thing never loses traction. I haven't had one scenario where I've lost control of this vehicle, which is something I do every single time I stomp on the gas on this one. And for that reason, along with the fact that it is a mid-engine sports car with a dual clutch 8-speed automatic transmission, this thing is consistently quick 0 to 60. This, on the other hand, is a little bit different. 0 to 60 is kind of where it falls short. Even though they both have an 8-speed automatic transmission, this is not a dual clutch. And even though I really like the ZF 8-speed in the Hellcat and other Dodge products, it's just not as quick as this vehicle. That being said, this vehicle does have a little bit more power when we're talking accelerating from maybe 30 to 70 miles per hour. When you've got enough traction in the rear end and you've got that supercharger going, when you stomp on the gas in this thing, it feels like you have a limitless amount of power. So if we're talking drag strips or racing or whatever have you, even accelerating on the freeway and passing power, this thing will take the cake over the Corvette. Don't get me wrong, this thing is still wickedly quick, and if you stomp on it from 30 miles an hour, this will get to 70 very, very quickly. But it doesn't jerk your head back to the back of the headrest as quickly as this one does. This one kind of breaks your neck when you stomp on the gas. This one doesn't do that. It's a little bit more precise, a little bit more linear in its acceleration. And that's where I think the supercharger really comes in handy and really beats this vehicle in terms of that type of top speed power. The other thing that I'll mention is attention. The amount of attention this vehicle gets is more than the Hellcat. Maybe that has to do with the fact that this is a pretty new car. It came out in 2020. It's unlike any other Corvette before it. It looks like an exotic supercar, and this thing has been around since 2015, and the body style has really been around since like 2008. So this is kind of an aged platform. People are more used to it, versus this thing is, a little bit more unique and bespoke. Going to a car show, this thing is going to get as much attention as a Lamborghini or a McLaren. This thing used to get that type of attention, and you may still get quite a bit of attention at car shows, but driving in day-to-day traffic, people just think of this as a regular car because, this looks kind of very similar to like an SXT V6 Challenger, and this thing doesn't look like any other vehicle on the road aside from these super expensive, ultra exotic supercars. So this is going to get more attention, more eyes on it. You're going to see people taking more photos of it and turning their heads on the road. And this thing, even though it does get a lot of attention, it's just not as much as the C8 Corvette. Now, the other thing to mention, I'm going to climb into the passenger seat of this vehicle to show you what that looks like, is I think this vehicle is a much more appropriate GT car. And for those of you that don't know what that means Grand Tourer. It's kind of a vehicle that has, plenty of power, very, very easy to accelerate and quick, but also extremely comfortable. One that you would go on a Grand Tour, which is kind of like a long road trip. This vehicle, I think, is definitely better as a GT car than the C8 Corvette. Even though, Chevy kind of designed this to be more of a GT vehicle, this thing is much better at that. It's just more comfortable. It's much larger. I mean, here I am stretching out, and I still have plenty of space to kind of scoot back and lay all the way down. This thing just feels massive on the inside, and just kind of makes it a more comfortable GT experience compared to the C8. I think I've come up with the perfect analogy comparing these two vehicles. To me, the Dodge Challenger Hellcat is like an Arnold Schwarzenegger action movie. Or for those of you that don't know who that is, shame on you, but let's say this is like a, Marvel Avengers action movie. You've got a lot of pizzazz, a lot of flair, a lot of theatrics with this vehicle. But maybe there are some plot holes and maybe things that could be done better, but still a very entertaining movie to watch. This, on the other hand, is like your serious drama movie, maybe an Oscar-winning movie where it's a very detailed plot, very interesting, you're kind of on the edge of your seat the whole time, and maybe when you finish watching the movie, you've actually learned something about yourself in the process. Now, can I say one is better to watch than the other? No, it kind of depends on your mood. Even though this maybe has a little bit less theatrics and just pizzazz about it, it's still just as interesting. And I think that's the best comparison to make between these two vehicles, is it really depends on your mood. They're very different in a lot of ways, but at the end of the day, you can't go wrong with either one. Now, the three reasons why I would pick the Challenger over the C8 really just has to do with my personal situation. The first reason is because this thing just has more size to it. Not that I use the back seats very often at all. all. But when I do take this vehicle on some smaller road trips, or when I have friends with me, you know, it's really nice to have those rear seats, and especially that rear trunk space to be able to fit, you know, an overnight bag or even a weeks-long bag and just go on a road trip in this vehicle. I can't really do that with this. Even though I could probably do an overnight bag, I can't really do like a large piece of luggage, whereas I can definitely do that with here. And then just groceries and just stopping by Home Depot, I can fit actually 2x4s in here. If I roll the rear seats down, I could never do that in something like this. So this one is just a little bit more practical from a daily driver standpoint. Now, the second reason why I'd pick this over the C8 has to do with the comfort and ride quality. This thing is just a more comfortable vehicle to drive. Not only is it softer on the suspension, this one kind of beats you up a little bit when you're driving. Now, this is probably the softest mid-engine sports car on the market, but it's still not as soft as this vehicle. I mean, this thing almost drives, you know, like you would expect a Cadillac to drive. Now, it's not the softest vehicle, it's not a Mercedes S-Class, but it is really comfortable, versus this is kind of like any other sports car you would drive. It's a little bit rough on the suspension. You know, even though they're both low-profile tires, this one feels like it just doesn't have as much suspension travel, so you're feeling more of the bumps in the road. The other part of that comfort standpoint is the road noise. I think this vehicle is better insulated than the C8 Corvette. Now, that could do with a few different things like weight reduction, could also do with the fact that this thing cost probably a little bit more to develop than this thing, and so in order to keep the price point around $65,000, they had to cut costs somehow, and so they had to reduce some of the noise reduction capabilities of this vehicle as compared to the Hellcat. But this thing on the freeway is a little bit quieter in my opinion. That's not just my opinion, my wife has said the same thing. This is just a louder vehicle on the inside, which is a little bit surprising considering this is a Corvette. Now, the third and final reason why I would pick the Hellcat over the C8 Corvette has to do with the theatrics of this vehicle. Kind of going back to the fact that this is an action movie, I really like the sound of the engine and the exhaust in this vehicle. And even though you could get an aftermarket exhaust system and modify it and make it sound better, this thing from the factory, even if I didn't do the Dynamax race bullets, sounds incredibly good. And you know, that's part of the driving experience. You engage more of your senses, and as you're accelerating in this vehicle, you feel like it is some sort of spaceship accelerating off into space. As soon as this vehicle turns on, everybody's turning their heads to see what's going on, because this thing has those theatrics. And that's just kind of the mood I'm in right now. I'm in the part of my life where I want an Avengers action movie, and that's what this thing is. This is a scalpel that will be perfect in a lot of different ways. It's going to be way quicker, and this is a car I could actually probably beat a Tesla 0 to 60, versus this thing is, you know, not the quickest and likely going to be beat by a lot of, you know, Subaru WRXs because they have all-wheel drive, but this thing has that kind of personality to it that I just don't think this one really has. And for that reason, I am still in love with the Hellcat. Now, that's not to say this one is still better than this, because like I said, it really is up to what point of life you're in and whether you really need more storage or comfort. You know, if this is not your primary daily driver, you really can't go wrong between the two. And my suggestion is, if you have a second car and you're looking between the two of these, just pick whichever one's cheaper, because either one of these are going to be just as fun to drive. Okay, well, there you have it, folks. Those are the major differences between the C8 Corvette and the Dodge Challenger Hellcat. In a lot of ways, they're similar, and in probably more ways, they're different. Is one better than the other? Well, it's up to you to decide. Those were just the 3 reasons why I'd pick this over a C8 Corvette, but it really depends on your situation. I do hope you guys enjoyed today's video comparison. If you did enjoy it, make sure you hit that like button, because that helps me out a lot. And if this is your first time stopping by, hit that subscribe button so you can stay on top of all of the weekly car videos. You can also find me on all of the social media down in the description below at Schwazy_. And until next time, everybody, I hope you stay Schwazy, stay healthy, have a wonderful day.